Welcome, everyone. I'm Kaylin Carlson. This is the Summit of Grace, the moral injury of abortion. It is so wonderful to have you today. We have worked tirelessly, probably for the last 6 months, bringing this to you. And this is Dina Jones, the Vice President of Choose Grace International. Dina, you're so wonderful. Thank you so much for all your wonderful work.
Thank you. And you are so wonderful too. You are so wonderful to work with. This is just a dream come true to have all you with us and to actually be here on day one of the Summit of Grace.
And I am so excited because when I was 17, I had an abortion. And it just, I didn't know it at the time, but later, like 7 years later, it just rocked my world. And I suffered from trauma, just a lot of grief, loss, you name it. And it's taken like 30, 35 years. And this is a culmination of everything I've learned from my experience. And I know you've learned a lot from all these interviews. And I'm just so grateful and honored to be able to share with you what I have learned and what others have also been learning as well about abortion. And there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of misunderstandings about abortion, and abortion is very complicated. And I had trauma, and I sought out professional counseling after, when I was at my lowest. And after that, I wanted to help people, and so I got an undergrad and graduate degree in social work. But this is just a culmination of my experience and from working with people and researching. I love researching. So we are so glad, to have you join us today. And I hope that this is educational for you as well as healing. And this is for everyone. This is for ones that have been harmed by abortion, maybe to help you understand yourself a little bit better, or loved ones that maybe have had an abortion and you're like, I don't know how to help her, or I don't know how to help him. And for people, that just need that understanding of the post-abortive mind, of people that have had abortions and what they go through. So this is a culmination. We've had over 40 interviews, almost 50 speakers for the summit. And the big revelation, what I feel is a missing key, is the moral injury of abortion that we don't talk about. And it's a fairly recent new term. And I learned about it, Dina, through studying. I started studying toxic shame and ruminating shame because I know that so many people have a hard time forgiving themselves. And the shame can just be toxic and just take over your life. And so I started researching, and I came across the moral injury of abortion. Well, the moral injury, which is used with combat veterans. And it's a fairly recent term coined by Jonathan Shea. And our next guest is Dr. Harold Koenig, and he is from Duke University. And we are starting out with him. And I had the honor of interviewing him. Now, he has written the most journal articles on moral injury. He is an expert in his field, and we were just so excited. I was excited to meet him, and he sees the parallels of abortion. And so we are just going to start off right away and listen to him to explain the moral injury piece, and after that, we'll go into a little bit more detail. Great to have you, and here's Dr. Harold Koenig on moral injury of abortion. Thank you. Well, hello, this is Kaylin Carlson, and welcome. And we are so honored today to have Dr. Harold Koenig with us. And Dr. Harold Koenig, I just really appreciate your time and your expertise and all that you've done on moral injury. And we met at the AACC, and I just felt like a little kid coming up to you and saying how wonderful you were and how I saw the connections between the moral injury piece and abortion. And I enjoyed your seminar talk. And like I said, it's so wonderful to have you today. So I have been so impacted by this moral injury piece. When I had an abortion, and when Vincent Rue came up with the term PAS, post-abortion syndrome, that correlated with the war veterans with the PTSD, I'm like, he understands me. This is it. And what I found with the moral injury piece is even something greater than that, because of what you've discovered with moral injury. I'm like, this is even better. Now it's an easy framework to say, this is how I've been hurt, and make sense of it. So could you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and what you've found and why you're so passionate about moral injury?
Well, I'm a psychiatrist and have been interested in the connection between religion and health for many years. And as I started to talk with veterans and active duty military, I realized the seriousness of PTSD and what occurs during trauma, and then learned about moral injury. Began reading about it, and then began trying to understand how you measure it. And by doing that, we've started to do research now on it in active duty military veterans, and we started to do it in healthcare professionals as well. And certainly it occurs in many civilians as they go through traumas of all kinds. Mm-hmm. This moral injury can set in, and the challenge is that a lot of times people get stuck there. They get stuck in the moral injury and they can't get past it. And even when you're treating various psychiatric disorders among those who are severely traumatized, unless you address that, a lot of times it interferes with the treatment response. So in general, we've started to develop these measures and also have developed treatments for moral injury. They are primarily for members of the military or former members who have been traumatized, but they could certainly be easily adapted and have been adapted for other populations undergoing traumas of all sorts.
Very good. And as we know, like the reasons why that the subject was so important to research on the veterans was because of the suicide happening every day. Like there was like there's over 20 suicides a day from war veterans. Is that still correct?
Well, certainly, there's a lot of suicide going on among veterans as well as active duty military, more so than you would certainly want. And there's more than just suicide. That's a relatively right. Small percentage, of course, but there's all sorts of things that interfere with the person's quality of life that moral injury appears to be connected to. So it really is. In fact, in our studies of veterans, we found that over 50% of veterans had some level of moral injury that was interfering with their ability to function. So it's very common out there. There haven't been too many studies among civilians, and there have not been any to my knowledge among those who have suffered from going through an abortion or who have been raped or whatever. Right. No studies really among civilians, although we do have a short measure to assess it in civilians. It's just that work has not yet gone in that direction to any degree yet.
And I see such a comparison, a parallel between your moral injury scale with war and men can feel after an abortion. And as I understand, the reason why it was so important was too that a lot of the methods in psychiatry, they weren't really hitting the core piece that they were missing, and that was the spirituality. of their moral concern or their moral injury of killing. And so would you like to take a moment and kind of go through the moral injury piece for our viewers to kind of help explain what we're talking about?
Okay, well, I'm going to talk about the assessment and treatment of moral injury. So what is it? First of all, what is it? Moral injury became popularized with the work of Brett Litz back about 10 years ago, when he described moral injury as an act of transgression that creates dissonance and conflict because it violates assumptions and beliefs about right and wrong and personal goodness. So that was the original definition. It's a syndrome that often occurs in the setting of trauma, such as PTSD, but it's also a distinct and separate syndrome that is not the same as PTSD, nor is it really part of PTSD. Although it became recognized among war veterans and active duty military because of their poor response to treatments that were being offered, it also occurs in other settings, including among first responders, such as police, firemen, emergency medical personnel who have to deal with traumatic kinds of experiences in the field. Also, it can occur among healthcare professionals who can experience moral injuries because of the decisions that they have to make that are oftentimes conflicting with regard to what the hospital will allow them to do, their own personal needs and their family's needs. And we see that in particular here during this time in our history because of the COVID-19 pandemic, where doctors are having to make very important decisions, including not providing care to certain individuals, which may violate their moral values and beliefs. Now, moral injury, as you mentioned, okay, is associated with, has both psychological and spiritual dimensions. Now, most people who have been working in this field over the past 10 years have focused on the psychological dimensions of moral injury, but they have not considered the spiritual dimensions. And to me, that seemed rather strange, since our entire moral framework is based on religious beliefs and traditions that have come to us over thousands of years, that have formed our moral beliefs and our values and our ethics. And yet, within the psychological field, that has all been ignored, probably because of the deep divide between religion and psychology that has existed for the past 100 or more years. So in any case, we focus in our measures and in our treatments on both the psychological as well as the spiritual aspects of moral injury. So I've got a slide up that you cannot see, but one that shows the kind of connection between the events that precipitate moral injury, the transgressing of the moral code by these events, and then consequently the moral injury that occurs that is manifested by both religious symptoms as well as psychological symptoms. So those psychological symptoms first involve guilt, shame, moral concerns, feeling betrayed by others in authority, having a loss of trust in others, difficulty forgiving others for what others have done to them, and also difficulty receiving forgiveness for what they have done. Mm-hmm. A loss of meaning and purpose in life, and also a self condemning of oneself for whatever role one perceived one played in this traumatic experience. And the outcome of this moral injury, well, also then there's the religious symptoms, which involve the religious struggles that one has over violating moral beliefs and values. One wonders, one feels punished by God or deserted by one's faith community, or doesn't feel loved by God, or as a result of these traumatic, how could God allow this? If this is a loving God, how could God possibly have allowed this to happen? It's almost, certainly it's a difficult question, and often results in a complete loss of religious faith, where people just feel, I don't, if a God would allow this, I don't want to believe in this kind of a God. So there's a complete loss of faith. And when that happens, of course, for many people, religious faith is how their world is formed and how they cope with trauma and stress. And where do you go if you lose that part of your life? Where do you go? I mean, you can go to a psychiatrist who will see you once a month or every couple of months and charge you a lot, or you could go to family. You can certainly do that, but after a while, family gets they don't want to hear it. Friends, you get the same response, and they're not available all the time, and they've got their own needs to fill. But having a religious faith provides you with a way to access, the Creator that is in control of everything, including this horrible situation. Although this Creator has placed limits on what he can do, he or she can do in this regard, because we all have free will.
Right.
And to even love requires free will. So there's no love if there's not free will to do bad things. And to make mistakes and these kinds of things. So this is a very important part of moral injury that has not been included, but we are including it. So that's kind of a description of the psychological and moral aspects of moral injury. And then a little bit about the clinical outcomes. And this is all on this one slide that I'd love to show you. And it includes PTSD symptoms, depression, anxiety, as I said earlier when talking with Kay, and relationship problems, pain, and physical disability, as people are overwhelmed with the struggles that they're going, these moral struggles and conflict, this internal conflict. Okay, so next slide has to do with measurement. And there are several measures that now exist to try to capture this concept of moral injury and identify it when it's present. In psychological and social in social, professional kinds of caring environments, you got to be able to identify it in order to treat it. So there are measures to do that. There are a number of measures. One of those measures is our moral injury symptom scale, military version, the MIS-M. And then that's a long measure. That's like 45 items. A little bit, it's great for doing research on it, but trying to screen it clinically, we decided to develop a 10-item measure, which is the MIS-M short form, which goes over the 10 major symptoms of moral injury and has the person rate those symptoms on a 1 to 10 scale. So each symptom each symptom, then the person is asked, to what degree have you experienced this, and how much disability is it causing you on a 1 to 10 scale, that it's not, I haven't experienced, I don't have it at all, to, I'm extremely, focused on this. It's, it seems to be what I'm struggling with. Okay. And so the next slide is actually an example of the military version, provides 10 items that can be asked, and with that 1 to 10 response form, response options, And then we have a civilian version of the 10-item moral injury symptom scale, which is covering a lot of the same items. I'll read those to you. I feel betrayed by those who I once trusted. I feel guilt over failing to save someone from being seriously injured or killed. I feel ashamed about what I did or did not do during this time. I'm troubled by having acted in ways that violated my own morals or values. And then the next question is just a statement, which is, most people are trustworthy. And, you know, the options are strongly disagree all the way to strongly agree. The next one is also kind of more positive. I have a good sense of what makes my life meaningful. Again, absolutely true or absolutely untrue. I have forgiven myself for what happened to me or others during this time. So again, that's, you know, people can strongly agree all the way to strongly disagree with that. All in all, I am inclined to feel that I am a failure. So that's that sense of, you know, self-condemnation
Right.
that I've been, you know, referring to, feeling that one's a failure. And then I wonder what I did for God to punish me. So there's a sense, you know, are people struggling with this, a sense of God punishing them for whatever happened on this 1 to 10 scale? And then finally, compared to before you went through this traumatic experience, has your religious faith since then weakened a lot, weakened a little, remained the same, strengthened a little, or strengthened a lot? So those are the 10 symptoms that covers the 10 symptoms of moral injury on that scale. It takes about a minute or two to administer. And so for civilians, that would be the scale that I would use.
And I would ask on that, on the moral injury scale, that the only difference that I see, I can see where them wondering what I did, asking like, what did I do that God is punishing me? For men and women that have experienced abortion, we already know. It's like, I did this, and I know that God should be punishing me. God is mad. It's like we already know what we did. So there's a little bit of a difference in that aspect with the moral injury piece. But certainly after the abortion, a lot of, you know, when we have miscarriages, or a lot of women have become infertile after abortion, or they've lost children, or something terrible's happened in their life after that, and they think, God's punishing me because I had that abortion. That's God's punishment.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And, you know, people have all sorts of different feelings in that regard, and those feelings change and evolve over time. And, you know, they're kept going. Those emotions, that internal conflict is kept going by these symptoms of moral injury.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's how it's manifested. And so that's why we think it's very important to address those.
I wanted to have a quote. This is from Julius Fogel. And he was both a psychiatrist and OBGYN, and as a pioneer of abortion rights, performed tens of thousands of abortions, testified that while abortion may be necessary and generally beneficial, I think it's a man, it always exacts a psychological price. And every woman, whatever her age, background, or sexuality, has a trauma at destroying a pregnancy. A level of humanness is touched. This is part of her own life. When she destroys a pregnancy, she is destroying herself. There is no way it can be innocuous, which means harmful or injurious. One is dealing with the life force.
It is totally beside the point whether or not you think a life is there. You cannot deny that something is being created and that this creation is physically happening. Often the trauma may sink into the unconscious and never surface in the woman's lifetime. But it is not as harmless and casual an event as many in the pro-abortion crowd insist. A psychological price is paid. It may be alienation. It may be a pushing away from human warmth, perhaps a hardening of the maternal instinct. Something happens at the deeper levels of a woman's consciousness when she destroys a pregnancy. I know that as a psychiatrist. What do you think about that statement?
Well, it makes sense. It makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
That it would have an impact on the person. I can't imagine what that would feel like as a man. I know that my wife had several spontaneous abortions that were horrible for her. She wanted that child desperately, and that it's part of being a woman is having a child and giving birth and being pregnant is part of being a woman, and so taking a life, it's just everybody's going to react in a different way depending on your background, your beliefs, your experiences, how you were raised,
Mm-hmm.
even genetic issues related to how sensitive you are to these things. So it is very different for every person, but it
Right.
certainly makes sense that it would have a long-term impact. Sometimes an impact that you're not even aware of, that might still be affecting your relationships in one way or another, or might be draining and pulling from the joy in life that you could otherwise be experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of truth in what he said.
And I have also this quote. It was in a book by Grossman, and he quotes, S.L.A. Marshall states, the average and healthy individual has such an inner and unusual, unrealized resistance toward killing a fellow man that he will not of his own volition take a life if it is possible to turn away from that responsibility. At the vital point, the soldier becomes a conscientious objector. And I would say that would be quite a few women. Now, we aren't saying that all women are negatively affected by abortion, but as you just stated, there are some with a moral compass and moral values or their worldview, their relationship to God, that these things are very serious and that can come up and that can thwart they've got the abortion because they were in a crisis situation and thought that it was going to just be safe, easy, and simple, and that they could go home and never have to think about it again. But that just has not been true. And I know from my life, I knew that there was something growing inside of me, and I knew deep down in my heart that I didn't think it was right, and I was scared, I was nervous, I was vulnerable. And it was afterwards, after my abortion 7 years later, when I was pregnant again and I had an ultrasound for the first time, and I saw a baby with head and arms, legs, and that was when my trauma started, because I'm like, that was a baby. And so, and I know that happens a lot of times with women and men who say, oh my gosh, I left the woman that, was pregnant. I coerced her, I talked her into having an abortion, or I abandoned her in some way. And he realizes that he didn't protect the child he lost. And he's just, there's not a lot, there is research that we're looking at with that, but just to be able to connect the moral injury piece, I think answers so many questions to what we've been trying to solve for so many years.
Yeah, your point about men being affected is really true. I have a patient right now. I'm a geriatric psychiatrist, so I see older people. I have a man in his mid-80s, who is a devout Catholic, who is tortured by the fact that he asked his wife at some point earlier in their marriage to have an abortion. And he really has not told that to anyone, except maybe me. And, it can affect people, particularly those who have some kind of moral compass. Of course,
Exactly.
the psychopath, of course, enjoys it. They enjoy it. They get a thrill. They get pleasure out of harming, hurting, killing people. And how that develops is just hard to understand. How a human being can not be affected by these things is hard to understand. It does, but it definitely depends on the person. And if a person,
Right.
their religious beliefs do tend to form views about and feelings about these things. And there's no doubt that there needs to be healing. A lot of times a religious form of healing needs to take place. That simply being told by a psychologist that you're forgiven, that's not gonna muster the things. That's not gonna work, because these traumas are so deep that rational logic cannot be used to access them. A lot of times, literally a ritual of some kind that goes deep within the unconscious, some type of ritual is needed for that healing to take place. A formal ritual in a group, in fact, such that the group even assumes some of the responsibility, for whatever happened, is necessary for that healing to occur.
And I like to think, thank you, I like to think about it as intra-transgressions and inter-transgressions, a betrayal of yourself and your moral code, but then there's also betrayal of transgressions interpersonally, like perhaps, like my father had said, he was going to kick me out of the house if I ever got pregnant, and I believed him. So I didn't know how I was going to survive. I was in crisis. I was 17. I was a cheerleader. I was popular. I didn't have that moral development, that understanding. At that stage of development, I lived for the next day, and just very vulnerable in crisis. And so, even though I guess I was one of those objective. What did we call that? Objector consciousness? I'm not saying that right.
Conscientious objector.
Yeah, conscientious objector. Thank you. And you talked about, too, the stories. Stories are so important. And I've been reading this. Are you familiar with this book? I'm sure you probably are. Achilles in Vietnam.
Well, that's certainly Dr. Shea.
Dr. Shea. And he has this is a quote from a soldier. And he says that the real reason is that soldiers fall silent is that soldiers have discovered that no one is very interested in the bad news they have to report. What listeners want to be torn and shaken when he doesn't have to be. We have made unspeakable mean indescribable. And I know that so many times when women try to tell their stories, they're knocked down. And a lot of times there's so much stigma, and sometimes our churches haven't always been very responsive, adding more stigma to the situation. Like, how could you have done that? Well, women and men think, well, I don't know how could I have done that. I don't know how I could have done that either. So it's really difficult, isn't it?
It is. It truly is.
Well, our time is up. I just so appreciate your time. Is there anything that you'd like to say to help end this discussion?
Well, we've got a lot of resources. I've listed them in my PowerPoint presentation, and I've recently published a book called Religion and Recovery from PTSD.
Awesome.
It's a very comprehensive one, primarily for healthcare professionals. But then I've also written this little book called You Are My Beloved, Really. And it's a very small book, and it was written to help people deal with this issue of moral injury in terms of experiencing the forgiveness, the transformation that can occur through religious faith, and through realizing that that God loves them. God loves them, and it is, really is anxious to forgive them and to develop a relationship with them. And it's just a matter of people realizing that, and then opening themselves up to that forgiveness and that love, which is absolutely transformational. So anyway, it's a little book. You Are My Beloved. I'm the author of it. You can get it on Amazon. It's about $8 or $9, so it's not going to put you out too much. It's one of them. I've written over 53 books now.
Wow, that's amazing.
The best of all of the 53. I can tell you that hands down. So if you ever want to read anything by me, get that little book and read that.
I'm going to order it today.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you so much. And also I want to tell our viewers that Dr. Harold Koenig has a curriculum that he is allowing us to adapt that we're so excited about, and we're going to be working on those dimensions and tackling those difficult subjects and learning how we can recover, taking his model that he is so generously is letting us adapt. So that will be coming soon. Thank you, Dr. Harold Koenig, and I just so appreciate you very much. God bless.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
My pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much. And also I want to tell our viewers that Dr. Harold Koenig has a curriculum that he is allowing us to adapt that we're so excited about, and we're going to be working on those dimensions and tackling those difficult subjects and learning how we can recover, taking his model that he is so generously is letting us adapt. So that will be coming soon. Thank you, Dr. Harold Koenig, and I just so appreciate you very much. God bless.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
My pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, we just heard from Dr. Harold Koenig, and I know that there's a lot of questions. And we chose Dr. Harold Koenig during this summit. We are going to open with one of his topics. That's why we chose him to speak first. And so during this summit, we will be going further in what moral injury is and what it means and how it relates to abortion. Thank you, and God bless.
Wow, that was a lot to take in, wasn't it? And that we were so blessed to have Dr. Harold Koenig. And Dina, what did you think of when you saw him? Because you knew him before, didn't you?
I did. I knew him from some of his other work, and I have just always respected his brilliance and his integration of the faith piece with the psychology piece. And so many things I could talk about in that interview. But I wanted to maybe pull out with you, if you could just take us back to when you first made that connection of moral injury, because you touched on it a bit, but I would love to hear again. You've talked about this 30-year journey you've been on of research, and this being such a key piece. I was wondering if you could bring us back to that point where you first applied moral injury to abortion.
I'd love to. Thank you for asking. So when when Dr. Vincent Rue, he came up with the PAS, post-abortion syndrome, and it is not recognized with the American Psychological Association. But when I saw that, it was like, he understands me. And for me, it was, Dina, life-changing, because I'm like, there's someone, I have PAS, post-abortion stress, is something that I can say, yes, that's me. And I was so pleased to know that someone understood me. And it's part of, it's part of the PTSD that I was experiencing after abortion. I had nightmares. I had avoidance. I wanted to bury it. I never wanted to think about it again. I had shame, guilt, self-condemnation, despair. And a lot of those things resonated with me with the PTSD. And then so in social work, you learn biopsychosocial, but you don't really talk about the spiritual side of it. And so for me, it was, how do you have that core being, you have that internal instinct where I really felt like it was wrong. But like in my social work practice, you don't really get to that core, you don't get to the morals. And so when I started reading about toxic shame and I came upon that moral injury, it was like, this is the missing piece. This is it, because you go against your conscience. You go against your moral values. So when I had my abortion, I was torn. It was like I knew it was wrong, but I felt like I had to do it anyway. And it was all fear-based, based on fear. And so it's like, this is it. It's the missing link. This is what we've been waiting for, because so you have the trauma with the PTSD, but you also bring in the moral injury piece that's your core identity. It's at your core, and that's where, like with war veterans, it's the secular psychiatrists, they weren't getting to that core piece because it was a moral injury, and it's the big elephant we don't want to talk about, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why this topic is going to be it's so important to talk about it, because we don't. And we don't bring about the term killing. And there are so many women, like myself, that we think we killed. We have killed our own unborn child. And at the time of my abortion, I didn't know how much later I would grow to love that child that I lost to abortion. And so this is the missing key. It is the conscience, and it's the moral injury piece that we've all been waiting on. So this morning, what we're doing is we are taking this morning as the research. We're building the framework. This is a conceptual framework, because so many times you hear morals aside, then we talk about abortion. Well, the moral injury of abortion is a conceptual framework. So if you can, take your hat off to either like the pro-life or pro-choice. Take your hat off and go with this conceptual framework of the moral injury of abortion, what it would feel like when someone feels like they have killed. And it's really addressing the big elephant that's in the room. And ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult topic we are aware of. This is going to be 3 hours, or 3 days, 24 hours of content. And it's not expected to be where you can just take all of this in. Do it in pieces. If you have an abortion past, take what you can get, but take care of yourself, because this is 35 years in the making of what we've learned. So this is heavy content. Take care of yourself. And what I particularly liked with Dr. Harold Koenig is he sees the connection between the moral injury of combat veterans and the moral injury with abortion. And he even had a client that had that ruminating shame because he had talked his wife into having an abortion. So this morning, now upcoming is Martha Shuping. And Martha Shuping, she is just phenomenal. I can't tell you more about Martha Shuping. So she has lots of research in her head, and she is just phenomenal. She has research. She is a psychiatrist. She is, she is She graduated from Wake Forest University in '84 and completed her psychiatric residency at the University Medical Center in 1988. She practices psychiatry in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and has more than 2 decades of experience in helping people recover from abortion recovery issues. Dr. Shuping is a co-author of the published research on abortion published research on abortion and women's mental health, and she is co-author of the self-help book 4 Steps to Healing. And I've also mentioned she's also co-authored or has written chapters in Peace Psychology with Rachel McNair. She is a gem, and she is going to be talking a lot about the research on abortion, so I hope that this is very helpful, and she also helps make the connection between moral injury and abortion.
And Martha, she's so easy to learn from. I've learned so much from watching all your interviews. And Martha she has such a calming voice, and she's just such a lovely person, and she is so brilliant. But she takes all of this research and she just pulls out these little pieces that you can just kind of take and apply and take with you. So if you're watching us right now, get coffee or water or whatever you like, and get comfortable. If you're only joining us from social media, from Facebook, you are going to need to be registered to continue to see these videos. It's completely free. All you have to do is go to summitofgrace.com, www.summitofgrace.com, and you'll see Martha as well as so many other resources and interviews and discussions, and we really want you with us. So make sure that you're registered, and we'll see you there.
And Dina, you have done a lot of work on our workbook, and they're not going to get the workbook unless they register, right?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. The workbook, it's not on social media. It's once you're registered, you'll get notes and biographies, and they're so beautiful. I want to give just this huge big thank you to Summer and Lexi, because they take information and they make it so beautiful and so organized and so easy to follow. So I want you to have this, because I'm a note taker. You're a note taker too?
Yes, so much.
Yes, I want you to have this because it makes it so easy to remember as we're taking in all this content. So make sure www.summitofgrace.com for a free registration, and that's where you'll really be able to take advantage of all that we have to offer this weekend.
And the workbook is free as well.
The workbook is free as well.
So please do register, and that is summitofgrace.com. All right, so here's Martha.
Well, welcome, Dr. Martha Shuping. It's so wonderful to have you. And we met several years ago, and I know you have worked extensively in abortion. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? And I know you've written a couple books, 4 Steps to Healing, and also you have authored some chapters in Peace Psychology. So go ahead and just tell us a little bit about your work.
Okay, well, I am a psychiatrist in private practice, and I've also worked in county mental health systems over the years, but my real passion has been to help women who've had abortions, to help with their recovery. And I've worked with men and women since really 1985, with the very first patient who came to me with this need. And of course, I had been actually an abortion counselor years ago. And when I was still an undergraduate at Michigan State University, I volunteered for an organization that was helping women to get their legal abortions during the year of Roe, when it first became legal and they could have their abortions there. I actually did abortion counseling. And at that time, I didn't realize that some women have abortions that they don't want, and that women can suffer terribly because of their abortions. Because at that time, I was still in my teens as a young college student, and they told us that there were no side effects, the only surgical procedure in the world with no side effects. So I did, unfortunately, help facilitate women getting their abortions. And when I was in my training then as a young psychiatrist, I had patients coming to me and having distress related to abortion. So I've spent the last 35 years trying to learn more about this issue and how to help, and working extensively in a number of different settings, particularly with women, helping them to recover from the effects of abortion.
And that is wonderful. Thank you so much for your work. I know I've learned a lot from some of the journal articles and, just some of the speaking events that you've conducted. So I really appreciate your work. And you've spoken many times about attachment of the mother to the unborn child during pregnancy. Can you tell us what you mean by that, by attachment?
Okay, well, the actual term, sometimes people refer to just attachment, but the real term is maternal fetal attachment, and it's attachment between the mother and her unborn child. And when that's been defined, the first time that was ever defined was in 1981, when it was defined in terms of the behaviors of the mother toward the child. And for instance, you know that during pregnancy, many moms will start buying baby clothes, or that normally develops between the pregnant woman and her unborn infant. And so they're talking in terms of the emotions, as well as the earlier definition, which related to behavior. And so I often think of it right in what Condon and Corkindale said. They were talking about the emotional tie or bond. And so right there is the word bond. And there are some experts who will kind of make some distinctions saying, well, it's only bonding if such and such. But basically, many of the experts use this interchangeably, and they will say bonding into a number of, there are people who are looking at the biological basis of it, and they will use the word bonding. And so that's what it really is. And we all kind of have some understanding of the idea of bonding. Now, even though it wasn't defined for the first time till 1981, it actually, this area has been studied for more than 70 years now. And this bonding does begin during pregnancy and not at birth. It's much earlier, even in early pregnancy, soon after conception. And it's been studied across many different countries and cultures, so it's not just something American or something in one country, but there are many, many countries and many continents where this has been studied. And in addition to the idea of behavior and emotions being involved in this, there's also even physical sensations that have been reported. There was a study in Norway where they studied some women who were trying to decide whether to have an abortion or whether to have their baby. And the authors of this study state that the women sensed within their bodies that they were pregnant, and they said this bodily sensation filled them day and night. And one of the women in the study said, I feel that when I was decision to keep it, it was because I felt it so strongly in my body. So there's something going on there that kind of sounds like it could be biological. And in fact, they have found that there's a biological basis by way of the hormone oxytocin. And that is, normally we think of that as being, it's related to giving birth and also breastfeeding. It has something to do with milk letdown during breastfeeding. But it's also been shown that this helps facilitate bonding between mother and child, and not only at birth, but it's actually produced very early in pregnancy. So there's a biological basis for that. And sometimes people call oxytocin the love hormone because it does promote bonding.
Wow. So I know that, some of the clients that I've had, when they call, they say, I patted my baby, I patted my tummy, and I talked to my baby, and then they went ahead and aborted, and there is a lot of psychological and spiritual consequences, and even biological. So, and with your experience, can you tell us how this attachment during pregnancy impacts women who go ahead and have an abortion?
Well, maternal fetal attachment does often develop even when the outcome of the pregnancy is abortion. So it may be that right from the beginning, the boyfriend says, no, you're going to have an abortion, or a young woman may experience her parents telling her, nope, it's going to be an abortion, you can't have that baby. and that does happen, that women are influenced by other people in their lives. And but even when it's going to be an abortion, women do bond to their child very often. And this is so well established that even in this textbook, there's a 2009 textbook that is published. It's endorsed by the National Abortion Federation. That basically, if you go to the website of the National Abortion Federation and search, you can find a textbook titled Management of Unintended and Abnormal Pregnancy. And it was published in 2009, but it's still available at that website. It's still considered a current textbook. And right on the cover of the book, it's got the logo of the National Abortion Federation. And what it is, it's a book by abortion providers for abortion providers to teach doctors how to do abortions. And so in this book, there's a chapter that has to do with abortion-related counseling, both primarily what women need in the way of counseling before an abortion, Abortion Federation, by their experts. And then also it may touch on just a little bit after abortion, although primarily it's for before abortion. But what they say, there's a table in this book, in that chapter, and in table 5.4, it says, it has a heading, says risk factors for negative emotional sequelae. And that means risk factors for having negative psychological problems after abortion. And they list in that table of risk factors, they list commitment and attachment to the pregnancy. And what that's saying is that for women who have attached to their child already, and then they have the abortion, those women are at increased risk of having mental health problems after the abortion. Now, there's actually a table of 18 different items. And when they say risk factor, they mean that if this factor is present before the abortion, you're more at risk for having negative symptoms, having adverse consequences after the abortion of some type psychologically. So, there's a lot of research that's based on that. I mean, the fact that they have that as a risk factor says they know some of the research, and they know that when women have attached to the pregnancy and wanted to carry the pregnancy, but for some reason could not or did not, then those women are more vulnerable to having negative problems afterwards. So, there's a number of studies that say in particular that the degree of bonding that is established during pregnancy is predictive of the degree of emotional distress and trauma symptoms that are experienced after the abortion. And so I can give you some examples of some of the studies. You talked about women patting their tummy or that sort of thing. And there was a study in Australia by Alliston and Astbury in 1996. And this study involved interviewing women in the waiting room at an abortion clinic. And it said that 40% of them were talking to their fetus. And so we don't know what they were saying, whether they were apologizing to the baby or, having, just saying, I love you and I'll miss you. But they talked to their fetus before the abortion. And 30% of them endorsed patting my tummy affectionately. So there's a big chunk of women that obviously had some signs of being attached to that child before the abortion. There was another study in 2004 by Dr. Vincent Roux and colleagues. And in that study, he interviewed both Russian and American women about their abortions. And this was published in Medical Science Monitor. And he asked them, these were women not from post-abortion support groups, they were just women at a gynecology clinic where he asked if they had an abortion in the past and would they be willing to participate. And so it was just in a general gynecology population. But asking the Russian women, 37% of them, looking back on a past abortion, said yes, they felt attached to their pregnancy or their child in advance of the abortion. And of the American women, 39%. So very, very similar, 37 or 39% of the women saying they felt attached to their child before the abortion. There was another study in Sweden, and in Sweden, they wouldn't be influenced by American evangelical pregnancy centers or, abortion is very accepted over there, and these were first trimester abortions, but they had something more than around 500 women in the waiting room prior to their first trimester abortions. They gave out the questionnaires. 67% of the women thought of the pregnancy in terms of a child and not necessarily thinking of a clump of cells, but an actual child. And then they also reported about half of them said they felt like they had a need to do some type of special act to resolve their experience or to make things right in some way. And so things would be, the special acts could be lighting a candle or apologizing to the child or something along those lines. And one of the women, there was both a qualitative and quantitative aspect. So you got numerical data of how many women in certain reactions, but also getting in their own words in that qualitative portion. They could write in their own words their experience. And one woman wrote, "Immediately when I found out I was pregnant, I felt like a mother. It felt like I had some kinds of affinity with the child, and now afterwards it feels empty." And another one of the women said, "I lit a candle for the little one and asked for forgiveness." And you can see if the little one had nothing to do with her and there was no relationship, there'd be no reason to light a candle or ask for forgiveness. And it was about 50% who felt like there was a need for some type of special act like that. Another study, which was qualitative, but again, it lets you, even though it's not a large study, it doesn't prove that this is every woman, and nobody says it's every woman. But in this study, you get more understanding of the women's experience. This is by Dykes and colleagues from 2010. And in this study, it was a somewhat small qualitative study, but all of the women reported that they continued to think about the child they'd aborted many years previously, even though they were already at the age of menopause, and they're looking way back to when they were younger women and they lost a child to abortion. They talked about remembering the baby at Christmas or at their birthdays, and they did talk about it as their child or their baby and wondering what would he be like now and what would he have become, and really having continued thoughts about that child from so long ago. And one last study I want to mention, there's a team of researchers, Curley and Johnston, who've published several studies about abortion. And they had one in 2013 where they surveyed women from 3 college campuses in the US and Canada, but three campuses. And every one of the women, they had only 151 women. And some of them, they had 89 who had abortions, and the rest of them were a comparison group. But all of the women who had abortions reported symptoms of PTSD and perinatal grief lasting on average 3 years. So these were young women who might have had their abortion during high school, but now they're in college and they're having symptoms. And the fact that they've got both PTSD as well as perinatal grief, that's kind of showing that some of their distress was about the abortion, about the grief of losing a child. And it was severe enough that about half of those women who had past abortions desired treatment for their mental health issues related to the abortion. And the authors felt like maybe that's showing that younger women have even more difficulty with abortions than, say, adult women, although that there's some evidence for that. But anyway, it certainly, it does affect women when they had attached to that child and then the child is no longer there. It's something that can be an ongoing source of grief and distress. And it has been associated in research, as I said, as a predictor of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the degree of bonding makes a difference. The more that they've bonded, the more risk of PTSD. And that also tends to show that it makes logical sense that the successful abortion recovery programs would include content related to recovery from that grief associated with the loss of the unborn child.
Very, very good. Thank you for all that research. That's amazing. And, you know, we have lots of stories, women sharing that, and for myself, that they didn't realize how much later on they would regret their decisions. So, I realized that, I loved the child I lost. I just didn't know it at the time because I was in a crisis situation. I didn't allow myself really to stop and think about it. So, that attachment and bonding, is very relevant. So can you help us understand PTSD in just a few little, what are some of those symptoms for the audience?
Okay, well, with PTSD, first of all, in the definition of it, there has to be an initial trauma. And there have been several studies that show that a reproductive loss, whether it's miscarriage or abortion, can be sufficient to be a trigger for the onset of PTSD. And some authors have written, even pro-choice authors have written about the fact that there are, for instance, the woman might see fetal parts, or there might be just the pain, or the thought of losing a child. There could be many different aspects to that. But there's two studies I think are important just to be aware of. There's a study by Douter Deet and her colleagues, which was from 2015. They did what's called a systematic review in looking for all the articles they could possibly find that related to abortion or miscarriage or some type of reproductive loss and PTSD. And they found 48 studies in all, and I think it was 27 of them that related to abortion, and the others were the other losses. But they showed that, yes, and many of the studies that they found out of those 48, they used numerical data where they had used before and after psychological testing, or they'd use some type of numerical way to identify that, yes, this is really PTSD, and they do have trauma scores on a test. And so Douter Deet was one, and the other one that I think is important, because it wasn't really about abortion, it was about PTSD. There was an author named Seng and colleagues, and they published in 2009 a study where they had looked at women who are currently pregnant in their current pregnancy, and looked at how many had PTSD, and then looked at what were the causes. They asked women, what was the biggest trauma in your life? And so one group of women said the biggest trauma was past abuse. But other women said their biggest trauma was a prior reproductive loss, whether miscarriage or abortion. And that was the second biggest group. So it is a major source of trauma for women. But then to actually have PTSD, it means that you have 4 symptoms of 4 different types. One is intrusion symptoms, which means the abortion is intruding into your life today. It's coming back on you in the form of maybe nightmares at night when you go to sleep, nightmares that wake you up and disrupt your sleep perhaps, or flashbacks, or just those intrusive memories where it comes back and you're thinking about it. You're supposed to be concentrating on your job, and instead you're thinking about that abortion, thinking about the baby that you miss, or thinking about anything related to that abortion. So those intrusions are one category of symptoms. Another category is avoidance. That, for instance, if you had the abortion, you really don't want to drive by the abortion clinic, perhaps. And I've known women who say they would drive a mile out of their way not to drive past the clinic where they had their abortion. Or I know one woman who used to call me and she'd be in tears when she'd see an abortion ad on television with a woman saying, very perky, saying, "I'm so glad we've got choice." And she'd had a forced abortion, so she'd say to me, "But it wasn't a choice for me," and that would trigger her, and she'd be very upset when she'd see that. So people would try to avoid anything that would be a reminder. That's avoidance. And it could be even avoiding your spouse, and we know that there can be marital breakups, or avoiding your own children, finding you've got to keep busy because your own children remind you. I've had women where they have their newborn baby, and they say that every time they look at that baby, they remember the one that isn't there, the one they lost to abortion. So intrusion, avoidance, hyperarousal is another category where there's been research showing that women who've had an abortion have greater difficulty with their sleep at night compared to women who have a newborn baby. That the sleep disorders in women who've never had a sleep disorder before, a percentage of them do develop sleep disorders, and it persisted. The difference between the women who aborted and the women who had newborns, it persisted for 4 years. So that's another thing. So hyperarousal, it's like too much bad energy. You're all jazzed up on bad energy. You can't sleep. Maybe you're irritable. And again, that hurts family relationships. If you're irritable, then that doesn't help your relationships with other people. But then the last one is a persistent negative mood, whether it's depression or anxiety, some type of persistent negative mood. And so those are the 4 categories. When people have PTSD, it is a very serious disorder because it is associated with suicide. And PTSD also, according to the Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual, it has lasted as long as 50 years. It can last for a lifetime. It doesn't have to, but for a lot of people, it is a chronic long-term illness. It's associated with a lot of disability. So,
50 years for PTSD.
sorry,
Is that what you said, 50 years?
50 years, yes.
Well, and that makes sense because, sometimes I get calls, from women that are in their 50s or 60s. I've even heard, Dr. Harold Koenig, who talked about moral injury, said he had a 70-year-old man that was still haunted by the memory that he coerced or, he talked his wife into having an abortion. And so he still lives with that. So, yeah, it's not surprising to hear that.
Right. Well, I know a woman I spoke to on the phone who was at that time 80 years old, and she had had her abortion in the 1940s. And she called me because she'd seen my name in a newspaper in regard to a healing program that was going to be offered. And she said because she was old and it was difficult to get out, she couldn't, it was an evening program. And she said she couldn't come to that, but she wanted me to help her connect with someone who could give her help because she was still troubled by this abortion after all those years. So certainly it can be a very long-term concern for people.
And I've heard stories from like hospice workers that, even on deathbeds, they admit for the first time that they had had an abortion because, they're dying and, they haven't reconciled that. So, how
Right.
sad to have lived with that, instead of, pushing through and getting recovery. And you said something about when you have that next child, and I just kind of like to share a little bit of my story. When I had my next pregnancy, when I had my daughter Emily, that's when my nightmares started because, when I looked at her, I saw the abortion and I had seen an ultrasound of her. So, it started, my denial came out after I saw my ultrasound with my daughter Emily, but then after she was born is really where it took a dive for me, and I felt like a monster. I had nightmares of where, I won't share the graphic details, but nightmares where I would save myself and let her die. And, those were very disturbing. And I had attachment problems with her just because I felt like, and I'm not saying anything that nobody else has said before, but feeling like a monster. I am a monster for how could I have ever done this? And so, yeah, I can easily see, that attachment. And then, you also think, what am I capable of? How could I be, because I wouldn't hurt a fly. And it just, it was just, a very vulnerable time, and you make a decision that you regret, and, it really does. And it's a life, and, how tragic that was. And I would give anything, right now to take that back. And that's what's so hard about abortion, isn't it? Because you can't unwind the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know sometimes people, from time to time, you hear about possible state laws on having a requirement before abortion that women have the opportunity to look at the ultrasound instead of having it turned away from them. And I think that some people mistakenly think that they're protecting women, that if you don't see the ultrasound, then you won't attach and it'll be much easier. But the problem is you can't protect a woman for the rest of her life to never see that ultrasound. And eventually, there have been some studies about this, that later when she sees the ultrasound of the first intended pregnancy, that may be a moment of shock and horror. Instead of it being such a happy moment as it should be, she sees her intended child and then remembers that there was that other child, and oh my goodness, I didn't realize it would look like that. I didn't realize it was a child. And so they have really distressed feelings. And I've heard women, I've seen research, but I've heard women tell me this, that seeing the ultrasound was a time that was very distressing for them because it brought everything together. And maybe they had been able to say, oh no, that wasn't a child, because the clinic said it wasn't a child. And yet when they see the evidence with their own eyes during one pregnancy, it brings back all the rest, and they take it on board at that time, and they realize what they've lost and what they've done, and it can have. And so it seems to me more fair to the woman to let her see the information up front and make her decision accordingly, rather than withhold that information and let her find out later and go through what you went through later. Because it may be that if you had seen the ultrasound at the time, you would have thought about it differently, or if it would have given you a chance to make that decision.
And Martha, when I had my abortion, I remember, we were like in a group around 14 women. And I just remember just rocking back and forth and, just really torn. I didn't want to be there, but I felt like it was my only option. And I was just rocking back and forth. And some of the other women, they were crying. And I just look back and I think, what I would have liked is someone to have recognized that there was real difficulty and, ask me the reasons why. For me, it was, I was afraid to tell my parents. And that's so true for so many. And, they offer abortion, they get taught, sex education about abortion in grade school. So you kind of see that as an option if you ever get, quote, caught. Well, if they would have sat me down, I think of a real counselor as a real healthcare professional would have been, what is it that you're crying about? What is your presenting problem? My presenting problem was of the shame, afraid to tell my parents, and a lot of the social and psychological issues. And we've talked about a lot of times abortion is based on fear. Help me with my fears instead of just offering this solution that might not work out. I know that a lot of times they're advocates and they think they're helping, but when we really get down to the core issue, many times that's not the right path to take.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, let me ask you, I'm interested to know, did you actually get any counseling at the clinic before your abortion? Was there a counselor that you talked to?
well, that's an interesting piece of information. Part of the moral injury definition is when someone in legitimate authority betrays you. And so, when I was 17, I was very vulnerable. And I looked at them, they were the authority, right? And so they said, we will have counseling. And so we went back and had our counseling. But, really what it was is the questions, is it a baby? That was my question. Is it a baby? And, so many times we're heard, no, it's a blob of tissue, cluster of cells, a product of conception. And is it going to hurt? And, no, it was like, similar to a tooth being pulled. And that it was just really quick and easy. You go home and never have to think about it. And, it was like, you have your career, you have this, you have that. And it all sounded just so convincing. And, it just, when they represent counseling, you have your trust in that counselor, especially when you're 17 and very naive and innocent. And so it was just enough when she said it was a blob of tissue, a cluster of cells, a product of conception. It was just enough for me to say, okay. And the horror of it is, Dr. Shuping, is that when I saw the ultrasound of my next pregnancy, my daughter was 2 weeks younger. She was 2 weeks younger than the child I had aborted. And so the details, just the realization of what had happened just all overwhelmed me. So, and that was 7 years later. And it's interesting, I wanted to talk to you about this real quick. A lot of the research is the day of, or, within maybe even the next day. How do you feel after your abortion? Well, you and I both know after the crisis, you do feel relief. And that is a lot of times what women, might say, but there's also a lot of other emotions that are tied into that. And what we don't do is, if it takes an average of 7 years for women to kind of come around, at least that's the last fact that with my research, that it takes approximately 7 years. I don't know if you feel that same way, but like 7 years for them to come around and to acknowledge that they had been harmed, but that abortion later on, that onset of PTSD is later on. It may not be just immediate. And so we really need to research way beyond to see if there is, a correlation of mental health difficulties after an abortion. And that brings me to this point. You said earlier in like January 2020, there was a lot of headlines throughout the media that new research shows that women have relief after abortion and no negative emotions at all. And, that's just really surprising to me, because we're talking about, the Summit of Grace. I'm interviewing people that have struggled. We know of other organizations where they're helping treat negative effects on abortion. So tell us, how do you make sense on their research and about how the relief about abortion?
Okay, well, it is known that there is relief after abortion for many women, and that has been reported. And partly it's because it was such a terrible stress. You've got that tension between, perhaps as you did, wanting the baby and then feeling like it was a terrible situation and wanting to be free of that burden and not knowing what to do. And because of the dilemma and all the energy that it was taking, some women can feel relief. And yet, the relief can coexist with other negative emotions. And over time, the other negative emotions can grow beyond that. But I think it's important to understand that the study that we're talking about was done by Corinne Rocca, R-O-C-C-A, in 2020. And she used a data set that is known as the Turnaway Study. And I want to tell you a little bit about that in a minute. But I think one of the things I want to say is that in the background section of her article, when she published a scholarly article in a journal, and she cited, as you do, she cited other people's research saying, all these different people have found no negative emotions after abortion, only relief, and nothing but relief. So I want to tell you about one of the studies she cited, and it was by, which she's misinterpreted, it is by Brown in Norway in 2005. And what they found, they compared miscarriage to an abortion. And I think everybody realizes that after miscarriage, most women would have some grief or some degree of distress. If you hope to have a child and then you miscarried at 3 months, something like that, that many women would have some grief and distress about that. So we know that's not a happy thing for most, unless for some reason you didn't want the pregnancy, but that's, by and large, women want their child, and it's sad when they miscarry. So comparing that to abortion, we find that on many points, the women who had abortions had more negative symptoms. And it wasn't, with some things, it was one way, the miscarriage women had the higher distress. Other things, it was the women who had abortions. But just for example, just a second. Sorry.
Fine.
Okay, so there was relief. It showed compared to abortion, compared to miscarriage, there was more relief even for a whole 5-year period at every point measured from 10 days after the abortion until 5 years after. There was still more relief when people thought back about that abortion. But there was also, for the abortion group, increased guilt and increased shame. And of course, there was no reason for anyone with a miscarriage really to feel guilt or shame for the most part, and it was close to zero most of the way through for them. So miscarriage, very little guilt or shame, but with abortion, increased and statistically significant guilt and shame. In addition, when you looked at anxiety, I was thinking if I could show my screen, just a second. Okay, Lynn, can we stop this for a second? Will it be able to pause the recording and put it together? I hope that.
Yeah, we can stop.
Okay, just a second. Let me get this up. show you. I can't remember how to do this now. I'll just let it be dropped in. I'm sorry. We can drop in the slide later. So
Sure.
let's pick it back up. Okay, so I wanted to show you about anxiety after abortion and after miscarriage. There's a green line on this graph that shows the anxiety in the general population. And some people do have anxiety for various reasons. Could be job situation or illness or whatever. And people in the general population do have some anxiety, but it was significantly higher in the abortion group at everywhere from 10 days after the abortion for a full 5 years. It was statistically significant as far as how much higher it was compared to the general public. For miscarriage, there was some increased anxiety, but it wasn't as high as the abortion group, and it was only significantly different at one point. That they were right at the 10 days after the miscarriage, they did have significantly more more anxiety compared to the general public. But after that, it faded down a little bit, and it wasn't significant after that. So it was the ones who had the abortion had anxiety all the way through. So that's kind of a negative mood there. Anxiety could be a disorder, but it can also be a mood. And clearly the women who had the abortions had that negative mood. So one other thing, we talked about avoidance being a symptom of PTSD, and they showed in this Norwegian study by Brown, they showed using a psychological test called the impact of events scale. They showed by two different ways of measuring. They showed more women affected and higher average scores all the way through. And if you look at 5 years after the abortion, the significant avoidance and not the miscarriage women. So again, that's just showing there's some negatives that can go along with this. And the lady who, Roca in her study, she misrepresented Brown's study in saying that there's only relief. She made a statement, there's only relief and no negative emotions, and citing Brown as evidence for that. And that's just not true. That's a misrepresentation of Brown's study. In fact, if you go on, there's other studies. There was a sample of women in Belarus in one study where they reported guilt after abortion, even though most of them were not churchgoers, and the Soviets had been enforcing atheism for about 70 years. And then in a study of Russian and American women, we'd mentioned a study by Vincent Roux, the American women, 78% of them reported guilt, whereas in Russia, almost half of them, 49%, reported guilt. So there's a lot of guilt and shame. And then, my goodness, suicide. I'm thinking about a couple of cases that I know about. A girl named Stacy Zally died by suicide at age 20, and she left a suicide note stating that she wanted to be with her baby. And this made the news and was on the internet and in many news reports. And so that's something that I can talk about. I wouldn't talk about my own patients, but I have actually known people who've committed suicide directly because of an abortion. But in this case, Stacy had an abortion that she did not want against her beliefs because of pressure from her boyfriend, and left the note so that we know what was going through her mind. There was also a British artist, Emma Beck, who was in the news, and she committed suicide after an abortion in 2007. And what she wrote was, in her note, she said, "I told everyone I didn't want to do it, even at the hospital. Now it is too late. I want to be with my babies." So we have that. And then there's a study by Gisler and colleagues from 1996, and they have a graph that will showing if no women who had no pregnancy have a relative risk of 1, and that's arbitrarily set as, like, there's a certain number of people in the community who would have abortions just for various reasons, and if you set that at 1, then comparing with abortion, the relative risk is about 3.6, something like that. So you can see on the graph that it's much higher, those who died by suicide after abortion. And you can see that in after giving birth, in this study by Gisler, the women who gave birth had only half the suicide rate compared to the general public, and miscarriage was kind of in between about a relative risk of 1.5, but in between, not nearly as high as after abortion. So there was some distress, and some women committed suicide for whatever reason, but it was much higher after abortion. And something like 6 times the rate, if you compare women who gave birth to women who actually had the abortion, it's about 6 times higher. And then a different study was done by David Reardon that showed there was an increased risk of suicide for up to 8 years after the abortion. So following women for an 8-year period. And the thing about this study is, by Gisler, they linked the actual medical records with the death certificate. So you knew exactly which women had had which type of pregnancy experience, if any, and whether it was birth, miscarriage, or abortion, and also knowing that they definitely was a suicide. So if there were ones that they, for instance, if it was an accident and you couldn't tell if it was really suicide, then they don't know. But for the ones that were classed as suicides, they have that data. So it's just showing you can't always know, was it really because of the abortion? We just know that women who had abortions certainly have a higher risk. And in Reardon's study, he was able to control for prior mental health, and the abortions apparently had nothing to do with prior mental health. So again, it's just there's a lot of distress, and it's misleading to say that it's only relief, and nothing but relief was Rocha's message, and it's simply not true. Now, the problem with Rocha's research is the data set that she used. And the Turnaway study was developed, this data set was developed by a group of pro-choice researchers at University of California at San Francisco. And this particular research group is really focused on these reproductive issues from a pro-choice perspective, with pro-choice to get their abortion, so they were turned away, and that's how they got the name Turnaway study. That women, it may be that by state law there could have been a limit so that they were too late to get their abortion, or it could be that the particular clinic they chose had a gestational limit, but they were too far along to get the abortion that they said they wanted. And they were comparing those with women who came to the clinic and did have an abortion. And authors of that Turnaway study data set, what they wanted to show was women who were forced to carry an unwanted pregnancy, to be able to compare them with women who aborted an unwanted pregnancy and see who did the best or who did the worst, to have a comparison. But one of the problems that people don't realize is that there would have been post-abortive women in both groups because they didn't consider prior pregnancy. And we do know, it's a fact, that about half of all abortions today are repeat abortions. So half of the women going to that clinic very likely had had a previous abortion. And if they'd had trauma or distress, either from a previous miscarriage or a previous abortion, that didn't matter. They were already, you would have ended up with women in both groups who'd had a prior reproductive loss, and that would have sowed confusion into their data set. That's one thing. But the other thing that happened, they did this like at 30 clinics, and they put the clinic staff in charge of deciding in our study, okay? So there could be some bias in selection of people, for one thing. And the other thing, though, is that they started out with 3,016 women who were approached and invited to be in the study. And out of those women, only 37% said, yes, I will be in your study. But of the women who gave consent, 15% dropped out even before doing the first interview. So you're starting out with only about, you're not even getting half the women into it. And the thing is, then there were continued dropouts over time, so that by the end of the 5 years of this study, they were supposed to do 2 telephone interviews per year over a 5-year period. By the end of the study, they had less than 20% still remaining in that study. So 80% of the women were missing. So when you say, oh, yes, we've got data from all these women and we know least likely to get into a study and least likely to stay in a study. People don't want to talk about it because we talked that avoidance was a symptom of PTSD. So you avoid talking about it because it's very distressing. And so it's quite likely that some of the women who were more distressed didn't stay with that study. But the fact is, you've got 80% of the people missing by the end of the 5 years. And the other thing is they So why is it that all those women would not talk about it even for $50, basically? There's something going on there. And I think that we really don't know what the majority of women were feeling. The majority of the 20% who stayed in the study apparently didn't have, problems in one group more than the other. The other thing is that the Turnaway study is known, all the studies related to that, they're known for using measurements. And so they're asking their feelings, not using standardized psychological tests to find out how are you really doing, not looking with some of the more detailed tests, but just very simplistic measurements of very few choices. And I think it makes it difficult if one has mixed feelings. I think that they used poor methodology, so I would not put too much stock in that study. That clearly she has refuted herself by mischaracterizing Brown's study. That kind of shows right away that she's looking to make an extreme case and saying no negative reactions, only relief. And that's simply not true. That's not what you see in Brown's study.
And just to make a blanket statement like that there's only relief, it's just general relief, it's misdirected, and it's, it can be very misinterpreted to the, really what happens. So, yeah, I really agree. I mean, 80% of a dropout, that's pretty significant. And then to say that these are the findings,
I'm sorry, I should clarify, it wasn't 80% dropouts in all, but starting with the 3,016 women, they had something like 558 at the end. And so counting from the original,
okay.
yes, it didn't agree to get into it in the first place. So you lose the majority. The majority refused up front, and then additional dropouts brought it down to only 18% of the original sample. But I think that says something when you've got such a low participation rate. So that's kind of considering both the low original participation as well as the dropouts. But the net effect is you're ending up with 80% of the people not there, and you really don't know.
And, we've had some other interviews where, shout your abortion and being very proud of it. And, if that's the case, you would think that there'd be more people participating and wanting this research and wanting to participate if it was actually good for them, I would think.
So, and let me ask you, how many women are actually shouting their abortion right now? Do you know?
I don't really know that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, there's some though, I guess, we've seen on the media.
Well, and the thing to keep in mind is that we looked in that textbook initially, we looked at the attachment to the child as being one of the risk factors, but there were 18 risk factors, and many women have more than one risk factor. And in fact, in the study, there was a study in 2008 by the American Psychological determined from everything they've seen is that if we're talking about adult women, not teens, and we're talking about a first trimester abortion, not those maybe 100,000 a year or so, something that are after the first trimester. And if we're talking about only unwanted pregnancies and not wanted pregnancies, and there's good evidence that there are many women who want their child but have the abortion anyway. So, and not a repeat abortion, a single abortion. So single abortion by adult women, unwanted pregnancy, not for medical reasons. There were a whole bunch of exclusions. And by the time you get done with it, you've clearly eliminated more than half of the American women. And it's hard because overlapping categories, you don't know how many women you've eliminated, but different groups. Then you can say, if none of these things, well then sure, they're not having any problems. But the problem is, the real women who are going to clinics every day, many of them are going there for the second or third time or more than that. And part of that may be because of avoidance, because they've had one abortion, they get pregnant again, and they have that feeling, I'm not worthy to be a mother, or I'm afraid of being pregnant again. It reminds them their body feels the same way. It brings it all back. They're having nightmares. And for whatever reason, or their circumstances are the same, and nobody else wants to support them. So it's a repeat abortion, and they keep repeating. So, the real women, there's the repeat abortions, there's women who are younger, there's women who do have it for medical reasons, who have distress because they definitely wanted the child. There's all these different factors, and, real women every day have those things. And so they're excluded, as they're not the ones for whom we say, oh, no problem. That, and that's also having excluded a lot of the world literature to make that statement as well, because they really dismiss the APA. They didn't consider today. Some of them had already been published, even by abortion providers. And there are
moral issue with abortion. And, Dr. Teresa Burke in her book said that, she says that many to all, go against their conscience and go ahead and have an abortion. And what I found is, for many women, if they do feel like it's wrong, you have to do like a moral disengagement and able to have that abortion. And one thing that study, to remember too, they're looking at this, and they're really not actually investigating their values or their moral beliefs or their spiritual beliefs. They're just like, what are the psychological consequences of abortion? But if you add the moral piece, that is a lot of times what they're finding out, even in combat veterans, is that's where the trauma, it intersects with the PTSD and the spiritual struggles because of the moral injury piece. Mm-hmm. So, I think if we really want to do a study some research maybe 7 or 10 years after the abortion, mm-hmm. study how they morally felt, because a lot of times I get calls, I didn't know. I for other people, but I never saw myself having to do it, and I'm surprised how I feel. I didn't know.
Mhm.
You know, and so, you know, I think what you were talking about, Martha, you know, about the attachment, you know, it is so true. And, you know, the bonding, you didn't know that you were going to bond so much and feel so bad afterwards. So I thank you for your research and all of this conversation. It's a lot to take in with all of the research. I want to go to your book, Four Steps of Healing, and just to kind of give our audience what you feel like are the four steps. And I totally agree, but you say that there needs to address four specific areas or relationships after an abortion. You say their relationship with God, their grief related to the loss of the child, their relationships with others involved in the abortion decision, and their own self-esteem, which often suffers in an abortion experience. And I know for myself, my self-esteem, self-worth, you know, was affected. So can you just, you know, as we close, can you just talk a little bit about each one, like their relationship with God, or just the four specific areas?
Thank you for asking that. Yes, the thing that I've seen with so many women, first of all, you pointed out that women often violate their moral beliefs or their spiritual beliefs when they have an abortion. And it has been shown that for women who are Christian and who believe that abortion is wrong, or women who have moral or spiritual beliefs against abortion, those women do have much more distress on average, compared to other women, that is a risk factor, even though that's not, I don't think that's one that's recognized by the abortion textbook, but certainly it is a risk factor that many have recognized in published research. And so it stands to reason that if women have violated their own conscience or violated their beliefs, that they would need some way to reconcile that leaves them feeling some distress related to that. Spiritual distress is a concept, moral distress, moral injury. So, and I think that women, for the most part, need to resolve that within their own faith tradition. You know, if they belong to a particular faith group, that's probably, they don't want to be estranged from their own faith group. They want to be able to feel they've made peace in that way. For many women, the primary relationship is a relationship with God in terms of their spiritual beliefs. And if women have come to me and said they believe that they've committed the unforgivable sin, and some women say they believe that they're going to hell, they believe that God will not forgive this, they feel that they're permanently excommunicated from their church. And many women, when they go through an abortion recovery program, they come to feel that that is not the case, that there is a way to reconcile and to have healing in that area of their life. And so in my book, we give them a beginning of a way to explore that, and primarily through the lens of Christian faith. Other faiths would probably have to find their own way to develop that, but certainly gives a starting point for that. And then the relationship with the child, as we talked about, if there was bonding with the child and now the child is gone, they may have perinatal grief, just as was shown with the test that Curley and Johnson administered. And so if they have grief related to that loss, somehow that needs to be addressed. And some women will have a memorial service for closure. And for Christian women, it's helping them to recognize that their child is in the care of God who loves their child. And so for instance, there's a book by a Protestant pastor, Haywood, I'll Hold You in Heaven. Jack Hayford, I believe the name. And so I'll Hold You in Heaven is one that's a source of comfort to many, but we address that to some extent in the book. And again, most of the popular abortion recovery programs that more women gravitate to, the ones that are the most well-known, they will have a component on dealing with that aspect. And sometimes that would involve naming the child, but a number of things to work through the grief. Then there are two aspects to the issues with others, because one of the issues is that it's very well known, and Dowder Deet in her article said that having a support system, support groups, can help to mitigate the effects of abortion. And so naturally, some of those abortion recovery groups give women a safe place to talk about the abortion, where they're not going to be judged and where they can begin to heal. And just by talking about it helps to heal the shame. When you say it with others, And so others can be partly the need for support and finding a safe place to get that support. But the other side of that is that there can be great anger, for instance, if a woman was coerced into abortion, and particularly when there's domestic violence, that very often there's a high association between intimate partner violence and abortion, and many women have abortions that they don't want, and that can be called reproductive coercion. And so if a woman has been coerced, she may have anger toward the person who did that. She might have anger toward people at the clinic. For instance, you talked about very poor quality of counseling, and there are some reasons that's I know that's often many women's experience, and partly because the clinic abandon you there. So there has to be a way to process that anger and those feelings toward people where you may or may at this time, we had data on Rachel's Vineyard and Save One in terms of self-esteem. And I think there will be more research over time, but definitely that those programs help women to increase their self-esteem. I think part of it may be when you feel like you're the only one and you made a decision that you now have decided was not a good decision, it would, something in that leads you to feel badly about yourself for what you've done. You described yourself as feeling like you were a monster. And when women are able to see how other people had a similar experience, that it wasn't because you were an idiot or because you were evil, but you got into that situation that so many have fallen into, and you now have determined that for you that was not a good decision, and you wish you could take it back, but you can't. But still, it helps you to feel better about who you are, to lose the shame, and at the same time to increase your self-esteem. Forgiven and Set Free and Surrendering the Secret, there's data on both of those programs that there's decreased shame, which obviously the kind of the reverse of that, or the converse, would be perhaps improvement in self-esteem, but they could only measure with the test they used at that time, they could only measure that there was decreased shame. But the same test, when it was done with Rachel's Vineyard and Save One, it showed also specifically increased self-esteem. So that's good to be aware.
I like the fact that, in some of the recovery that I've done is, to have self-compassion. I am not that person, and to understand that is not me. I am a new person, and I wouldn't make those same decisions. So, there's self-compassion. You were in a very stressful situation, but also self-acceptance. We're not perfect. Everyone makes mistakes, and just understanding the growth of where you've been and where you've come from, accept yourself and love yourself, because, it was a mistake. It doesn't have to define you. And it's okay to love yourself and to feel compassion toward yourself in such a difficult situation. And, of course, self-forgiveness is big, but I really like the self-acceptance, that you accept yourself as who you are, and not to define yourself in such a way that where God doesn't define you like that. He defined you as a child, his daughter, and as an image of himself, as an image bearer. and we all are image bearers, even though we are, we have a sin nature and make mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true, because I think from a Christian perspective, we're all created in the image and likeness of God, and he does forgive everything and restore. That there's always, scripture says that in Jeremiah, he gives us a hope and a future, and that's there for us always. And so I think faith-based programs in particular, that that element, certainly. And yeah, I think self-acceptance is so good. I talk about in the other book, actually, in the peace psychology book, I have a whole chapter. There's one chapter in there on abortion, after abortion counseling in particular, and we talk about the aspects of forgiving others and self-forgiveness. And I think everyone agrees that that's important to deal with those issues.
Yeah, and I highly recommend this book. And, there's 12 chapters in it. And Martha, you have written 3 of those. Your chapters are risk factors, and then post-abortion therapy, and then a case for long-lasting distress after abortion. And it's packed with a lot of valuable resources and information. And there's also one we are going to be hopefully interviewing Catherine Coyle about lost fatherhood. And so, sometimes men don't actually get their needs met when it comes to abortion. So, hopefully if you read this, you'll. Mm-hmm. So, Martha, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, basically, in the peace psychology book, the chapters that I wrote really dovetail with the things we've talked about today, because in risk factors, we do talk about attachment to the child. That's one of the big ones. I spent several pages on that. And then under counseling, again, we don't cover the 4 steps per se in that format, but we do talk a lot about some of the same issues, basically. And then under the long-lasting distress, we talk about post-traumatic stress and how that ties in with these things. So it kind of recaps and goes beyond some of the things we've talked about today.
All right. Well, Martha, our time is up, and I could talk to you all day. You're just a wealth of information, and I just so appreciate you spending the time and educating us. And any final thoughts?
No, I just thank you for letting me be with you for this time, and I hope people will follow up with the books and the rest of the conference. I think you've got a good lineup there, and certainly really excellent speakers. So you've got a lot of dimensions to cover going ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha.
Wow, that was awesome with Martha. And you can see why I just think that she's so phenomenal with all of her wonderful insights and research. So how are you doing with all of this? For me, doing these interviews, I did say that I had suffered trauma with my abortion. And I know a lot of times these interviews, I got hyper aroused, which my heart would race. And it might be true for you too. Moral injury does not have to be just the person just the woman that's had an abortion, or even the man. Society at large can have a moral injury of abortion. So if you're affected, if you're like hyper aroused, I know that this was a lot of information just in this short time. We also want to treat ourselves. And so let's just take a minute to breathe. And so breathe in for 5 seconds, hold for 5 seconds, and then breathe out for 5 seconds. And that allows us to get some oxygen, just to take a breather from what we've all digested just over this very short time. So would you do that with me? So breathe in slowly, 2, 3, 4, 5, and hold it, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then release it out of your mouth, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's do that again. Breathe in, 2, 3, 4, 5, and hold it. 2, 3, 4, 5, and breathe out. 2, 3, 4, 5. Thank you. So, we have another guest, very special guest. Her name is Lexi, and she is with Choose Grace International. Thank you for joining us, and she's been behind the scenes as well, helping us make this to be a success. And Lexi is our Director of Administration. And so, Lexi, I know that this has been a long 6 months. We've seen a lot of ups and downs and challenges through this. What have you learned?
Yeah, so I'm a graduate student at Liberty University, and I got hired about 6 months ago when we were starting to plan the summit. So I've gotten to see all of these recordings and interviews take place, just like Dr. Shooping's. And it's been a crazy ride. The moral injury piece is really special to me because it gives a reason for many men and women's feelings that they haven't found before, and they felt like something was wrong with them, but really it comes down to the moral injury piece. So I think that's really special. So I've learned a lot about that, and I'm just so blessed by both of you, and I'm so thankful I get to be here, and I thank you all for tuning in and watching as well.
Well, you are such a blessing, Lexi. Anything that you see happening on our website or in this summit or on our social media, you can pretty safely just guess that Lexi has had a hand in it. So you have been so wonderful. And I know we've talked about how we've both learned so much. Is there anything that stuck out to you overall or in this interview?
In Dr. Shooping's interview, I really liked how she brought in the PTSD aspect as well, because moral injury and PTSD are two separate things. But she talked about each of the symptoms that women can face and the risk factors, and I think that it's really important to hear some solid research, and she has a lot of it. Her mind was brilliant. When I was watching her recording, she had so much research just off the top of her head. So I think it was important to hear kind of the biological aspect of it as well.
That was really interesting to me, Kaylin, because it went so hand in hand with your own story when Dr. Shooping was talking about sometimes there's trauma triggers and sometimes the trauma is not right exactly in the moment. There can be specific responses that men and women are having, not necessarily in the immediate moment, because in the moment sometimes it's a fight or flight, or it's just the tyranny of the moment, there's a crisis, but then as the years go on later, there can be these trauma responses.
Right. And you know, that's been my frustrating thing, because when a lot of the research is just that day or just right after, and so best research, which I think is, you know, let's look at it maybe even 10 years down the road. You know, where are they at now with their decision? And, you know, because trauma grows. And also just because, you know, you deny it, you ignore it, you stay away from it, and then, you know, your conscience doesn't let you get rid of it. You know, your mind, it doesn't. So, you know, it grows, and that pain grows, and trying to stuff all that, then you have those, those negative reactions. And I think too, you know, one of Gail Sheehy said that when she starts researching, it's all about the stories. And we have offered a mix. We have offered experts and spiritual leaders, but we also have included stories for you, and stories where women and men have been harmed by abortion. And a lot of times we don't talk about the men, but it really is men, women, and families that are negatively affected.
Right.
So.
And we've seen so much emotion from men in these interviews, and it doesn't really seem like society has given permission for that. And that can just lead to so much when we're trying to bottle it up, or when, for a lot of people, if a trauma trigger happens or if someone gets traumatized years after the activating event, it can become this thing of, well, why would I bring up something from the past? So if anyone's feeling that way, if anyone's feeling like really be struggling with it, it's actually very common in that now, even if an abortion experience is years in your past.
Trauma is it, if you don't have that issue resolved, it stays in the immediate. You don't see that really clear down like in the past because it's still right there. And so it's just like with the combat veterans, you know, they're right there too, and they don't see it clear in the past, if that makes sense. And you mentioned, so upcoming, we have Greg Hassick, and he works with trauma. He works with men and women who have had an abortion, and he actually shares, he has an experience too with his abortion. And so it's just a phenomenal interview, and he talks about the trauma, and he was the one who led me to the book, The Body Keeps the Score, that I have been very enlightened with. And it just has really helped me to see how we store our trauma. And we're also going to have Dr. Barbara coming up, and she is a trauma expert as well. And she is going to give us a special gift, and at the end of the day, give us a meditation that will help us to end the day beautifully, because I know that this is such a hard topic. Another speaker that we have is Father Nigel, and I had just met him, and we just connected on such an emotional level, and just very excited for you to hear that. And he also has an abortion story, and he also does moral injury with combat veterans. So he is just an expert within his field, both with experiencing it and also helping with the combat veterans. But enough about that. Dina, I'd like you to share about the All Access Pass and about some of the other things that you were going to.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure, as Kaylin is talking about these things, we have so much incredible information, and if you're joining us just from social media right now, you'll see that the videos end and cut out and go away. We want you to have access to everything and have access all weekend. So we want you to go to summitofgrace.com, and it's a completely free registration, and there you can get access. So instead of watching on social media where you see us go live and then you see us go away, what you will actually do on the summitofgrace.com is get access for the full weekend. So that's summitofgrace.com. And then this is so much information. All of these interviews that we've done, all of the workbook material, you won't be able to soak all of it in just in this weekend. And that's okay. We want you to take breaks. We want you to take care of yourself. We want you to get what you can at a pace that feels safe and comfortable and natural to you. So we've created something called an All Access Pass, so that if we get to the end of this weekend or even today or tomorrow and you're feeling like there's so much here that I need to learn and that I want to go back to, not all just crammed into one weekend, we've made the entire weekend, all of the interviews, the workbook, everything available for only $79, which is Kaylin's gift because the value is so much higher, but she's taking it to $79 for this weekend. If you would like to purchase lifetime access to all of the recordings, all of the lives, the workbook. This is also wonderful if you're in a role like a coach or a small group leader or a teacher, in some kind of role where you want to have a library of information that you can reference back to if there's someone in your sphere of influence that is dealing with pregnancy loss trauma. and you think, oh, there was something in the Summit of Grace that was really, really, really going to help them, we would love for you to just have this in your personal or professional library so you can go back. And you'll see that information on summitofgrace.com, which is the same place that you need to go if you're just watching us from social media and you need to get registered so you can continue to see all of the videos.
And I just have to say, too, that I would love to keep this free. It would warm my heart to keep this free, but we have spent quite a bit of money putting this together, and happy to do so. But this is a way, the $79 pass is a way for us to help pay for the summit. So we offer it as a gift for these 3 days, but also understand we have some bills to pay, and so that's where the All Access Pass will go towards, is paying for the summit.
So again, that's summitofgrace.com, www.summitofgrace.com. That's where you can either register or where you can go ahead and get the All Access Pass.
And I'd like to talk a little bit about, so we have the live events of the speakers, but we also have interviews that you can tune into for the day. And I'd like just to take a few minutes to talk about that. It was a very difficult decision on who to pick, and just very difficult. And I really absolutely love all of these. Now, Rachel McNair, now she was, wow, she was over my head, let's just say. And you'll even hear in the interview that she doesn't like the term moral injury. And when I was interviewing, I'm like, oh my gosh, she doesn't like the term moral injury. But she has been studying this for years. And she has some terms that she says, well, this is what I really feel. And this is the step where she was seeing this issue. And I want to go back and really digest what she was saying, because maybe moral injury maybe that's how we explain it now, but maybe there's more to it. Maybe that this is a stopping gap between what she knows, but I know for right now, at this present time, this helps explain so much about the missing link of, as far as when you look at your body, mind, soul, and spirit, how they're all interconnected. The moral injury piece is that missing link where you add the core of your being, your conscience. And so Rachel McNair, it's a wonderful interview. She's deep in her thinking, so that's a wonderful interview. And I have to say, so Dr. Hughes and Dr. David Ward. So I am a PhD graduate. I'm not graduate, I wish I was. I'm working on my PhD, and that's how I came to discover the term moral injury. And I want to give a plug to Omega Graduate School. And this is them talking. And Omega Graduate School, you know, we always talk about wanting a safe place to share. Well, Omega Graduate School is a safe place to learn. And it's a faith learning integration program. And so they talk about, it's an Oxonian method of learning. And what I learned was fascinating. The key points is that during the Enlightenment period, I didn't know this, but during the Enlightenment period, it all went scientific. And we took the metaphysical out. We took the values, we took the morals out. And whatever could be scientifically proven. Basically what we did, we took the conscience out. And so everything was, you know, whatever can be proved scientifically. And so to me, that was key. And so out of that Enlightenment period is where we got our social sciences. That's where we got our social work, our psychiatry, you know, the social sciences. And so you can see then why this moral injury piece has not made it into this. Does that make sense? Right. So they talk a lot about the education piece, a lot of the history, how that came about. So that that is just it was very enlightening. And they talk about how to think. You know, there's andragogy and pedagogy, and I'm just learning these words. I'm like, what? So andragogy is what I'm doing now. It's like, these are the things I want to learn. These were my life experiences. Pedagogy is when you're young and you just kind of take in, you know, it's just kind of like feeding me. And we'll talk more about that later. And then we have Dr. Laura Lederer, and must watch. She is an expert on the human trafficking, and there is a huge link between human trafficking and also abortion. It really is a must watch. Lisa Kratz Thomas, also, she's written a book, and she has a lot of experience with researching Dr. Bernard Nathanson. She was trafficked, she's had several abortions, and she's also tried to commit suicide several times. I know at least once, if not several times. I'd have to watch the interview again. But suicide ideation and trying to commit suicide are very common. So our next interview, very exciting. Dr. Teresa Burke and Kevin Burke. They're a married couple. And Dr. Teresa Burke is the founder of Rachel's Vineyard. And I have attended Rachel's Vineyard before, and it's phenomenal. And she's totally surprised me, because she is actually studying, her curriculum to treat women and men after abortion, she has used that same curriculum on combat veterans. And so she makes that piece with moral injury. So it's just not only me discovering this, these people, you know, we've already been, you know, in this field, and I didn't even know it. So this is a very enjoy it. So Dr. Teresa Burke and Kevin Burke.
Well, welcome, Dr. Burke and Kevin Burke. It's so wonderful to have you today. And you are with Rachel's Vineyard, and you have studied abortion for so many years. How many years has it been now?
I think probably like 35.
35 years.
A life work.
Pardon me?
It's a life's work.
Life's work, yes. And we appreciate your work so much. I first met you, and you spoke about the detrimental effects of abortion. And you have written a book, Forbidden Grief, and I highly recommend this book to all people. It's a very good resource for you to understand the complications of abortion. And abortion is complicated. You know, I had an experience, Dr. Burke, just the other day where a gentleman I heard just said, you know, women don't love their babies enough, so they kill them. And I just had to cringe at that, because it's so much more complicated than that, isn't it?
It very much is, because a lot of women don't grow up dreaming they're going to have one, and it's not a way to exercise a fundamental right. They're usually under a lot of pressure and duress and anxiety and fear. And it's complicated because it impacts the woman and the family and the man on so many levels of not only their personality, but their psychic, their morality, their spirituality. And, you know, we're complex people because we encompass all those levels, including motherhood and fatherhood. So
Yes.
It's a damaging thing. And it's really so important that people integrate what has happened, the trauma of that experience, come out of the secrecy of it, and connect with others in order to end the isolation, because that's where the greatest suffering is in feeling like you're the only one who has all these symptoms and acting out, and people begin to feel that they're crazy. And you know, when I started all this 35 years ago, there was very little literature, and almost everyone who came in had that feeling like something's so wrong with me, and they weren't always able to connect the dots of the symptoms they suffered, the anxiety, the depression, the eating disorders, the relational traumas, the fear of motherhood. They weren't able to connect that to the loss that had never been recognized, mourned, or grieved.
Yes, and I know Dr. Vincent Rue, and he coined the phrase PAS, post-abortion syndrome. And not that it's ever been recognized by the American Psychological Association, but there is really a lot of symptoms that really goes along with the post-abortion syndrome with the PTSD, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that Dr. Rue linked every symptom of PTSD with abortion, and it parallels in the same way that you could see with the soldier's injury that was never recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder by any professional. In fact, it was politically incorrect to do so because we needed to see it as, the soldier being a hero and a warrior and strong. And when they were kind of crumbling under the weight of the moral and the spiritual injury, that wasn't something that anyone could put out there. And so it really became that there was more a defect with the person suffering, or it must be caused by something else because it just didn't match the image. And I think that we see that similar battle today that hasn't changed one bit among the post-aborted, that, everyone sees it as an act of empowerment, and those that are suffering under the weight of it really do so in isolation without a lot of validation or encouragement. And they're kind of in a no man's land of the isolation, which is so damaging.
Yeah, and and I know for me, I have experienced abortion, and for me, when I hear, let's celebrate our abortions, I feel like, no, I'm still grieving my abortion. I don't feel like celebrating because it wasn't good for me. And I'd like to talk a lot about your work with the combat veterans. And the thing with the summit is, we are tying the moral injury piece with abortion. We're paralleling that when we know that war veterans, they were committing suicide, and there was a study done, and they were wondering why are these treatments not working? And they weren't hitting the core, the foundation of their soul. And so we have to bring the morality and the spiritual issues into light in order for healing to take place, don't we?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, really.
So tell me about your work with the war veterans and the parallels you see with abortion.
Well, in developing a program that's designed to address the spiritual and the moral injury, which is Rachel's Vineyard, it's a sensory-based treatment with a lot of rituals for grieving and a lot of activities that allow them to bring forth the issue without being overwhelmed by it. So we have many meditations that is introducing them to a compassionate and a loving God who cares about everything that they're suffering and everything that they're feel shame or loss of dignity in the context of. So that's really the program, and I thought it was so I thought that it was so good we could apply it to some other traumas. So I made another week-long program for sexual abuse, which is spread all over the world now, like Rachel's Vineyard. And we've did the first pilots for Duty to Heal, Finding Peace for a Soldier's Heart, based on the same grieving rituals and spirituality and putting themselves inside stories where they're ministered to by a God who loves them and wants to lift them up, to raise them from death caused by the harm done, because there are parts of the spirit that die that are completely crushed, and it deteriorates their character and their ideals and their ambitions, and attachments kind of shrivel up. So attachments to other people, and it profoundly affects the ability to trust. And we see that across the board with many traumatic experiences. So before I went to the trouble to write a retreat for soldiers, I actually wanted to see does this technique work with combat veterans. So we did a pilot retreat by inviting a number of soldiers to come down in Florida, where we had the first one, to experience a Rachel's Vineyard retreat. So we are having combat vets in the post-abortion retreat. And, the story that I can share as briefly as possible is that the very first exercise, and we decided we wanted to run it with people from special forces because they're the toughest nuts to crack. They're trained to feel nothing. And one man, his wife was a psychologist, and she said he needs this, and he came begrudgingly, like, what am I going to do? He bought some friends because it was a project she wanted to, engage with and watch. And the very first exercise, this man that was like ran out of the room, and like a good psychologist, his wife ran after him, and he crumbled in her arms in the bedroom, and he was grieving. And here it had started on the first exercise as a result of the living scripture, because it's different when you go to a psychologist and you're talking about your problem, but when you're brought into a place where you're dialoguing right to God, that's a therapy for the soul, and it's a completely different dynamic. And people don't mess around then. They don't even try. Like, he touches them, and that's what's not in the script, but that's what God does, that we've seen over and over. And that's why these programs have spread. You know, I think Rachel's Vineyard's in like 80 some countries now, and 32 languages, I think. So it just continues to grow, because God wants to heal people, and that's the most important thing. But as this retreat went on, at the very end of the retreat, and everyone's grieving, the soldiers said to the post-abortive women and men that were running the retreat, they said, you know, we used to think that there was nobody in the whole world who understood what we go through on the field like that, in the killing. And they said, but actually, all of us were talking last night, and we all agree that you do understand. In fact, we believe that you have it worse than us, because it was your own children that you killed. And all the women were like, but what's come out of this is such a profound understanding. When women have been healed, when men have been healed of their abortions, this is the army of people. And I mean an army of people that are waiting to serve and duty to heal, you know, because they understand what that feels like, and they feel very motivated. And a lot of them that have been doing Rachel's Vineyard for 20 years are passing it on to younger people, and they're ready for the next challenge. You know, they want to get into another level. And, you know, that's real healing, when you can use the wound that you've suffered to help other people that have suffered the same wound, and then expand beyond that. So I just think, like, I never would have foreseen that to happen way back when I started this, when people couldn't even say the word abortion, and when, you know, it was just so rare. So it's, you know, we all need to stand together and help the nation, the world heal.
I absolutely agree. And you brought up a couple points I'd like to talk about. Is when you have these spiritual experiences, there is transformation that you know, unless you really press into God to experience it, you have to be intentional and allow the Holy Spirit to work inside of you. And when I've had my spiritual experiences, and a lot of times we call those the aha moments, and the Bible is living scripture. It speaks to us. It speaks to us through all generations, and it still is very relevant. And so when you have these spiritual experiences and you are freed from the guilt and shame, that's what you want to do, because, you know, we love each other. We love our friends, and we love other people. And for me, I didn't want anyone to suffer when I have the answers. And so that's my passion, is to share my experiences and and share other ministries that are doing the same things. So, Dr. Burke, how many people do you think that you have served over these years through Rachel's Vineyard and through your personal work as well?
Oh, there's thousands. I know we have about 500,000 volunteers around the world who are helping in the ministry, and most of them have recovered, you know, from their abortion. Most of our leaders are post-abortive, not all of them, but most of them. And many have suffered sexual abuse. So again, there's that affinity and secret, silent suffering. And the link between the sexual abuse and abortion, I'd like to mention, because, you know, we know what the statistics are, and I believe that the real injury is much bigger than the statistics because of the level of secrecy with abuse. But I see abortion, I've written extensively about that in Forbidden Grief, as a traumatic reenactment of previous sexual abuse, because the injury happens in this very sacred place that creates life, the womb, our sexuality, and there's a violation there. And there's many, many ways. It's like a whole seminar to discuss this link in detail, but I think it's an important thing to remember when we look at empowerment. We don't empower ourselves by taking the rights and the life away from somebody else without it deeply impacting our psyche, concept of motherhood, and who we view ourselves to be as a person. And the thing about PTSD is that at first, the problem's over with, and there can be a delayed reaction to the full recognition of what that meant. And I've just seen through the lifespan, right up to when people are approaching death, that it becomes an issue. So when people say, how many are suffering? I can honestly say we don't know, but I know that through the lifespan, someone that was fine with it in their 20s and 30s can have a breakdown in their 40s. They can be fearful of death at the end of life. So it's absolutely something that everyone needs to reconcile for peace. And that's what the world really needs right now, peace.
Yes, I really agree. That's what I did. After my abortion, I was like, I'm not going to ever think about this again. I'm going to move on. And then reality hit me when I saw the ultrasound of my next pregnancy. And I know that happens a lot. You did say you see abortion as a symptom of sexual abuse. When you say it's a symptom of sexual abuse, can you elaborate on that a little?
Well, just that there's something where you repeat the trauma. And a lot of women who've had boundary violations in childhood, who've experienced sexual abuse, or had abuse from older men, or a father, an uncle, which is sometimes the case in childhood abuse mostly. And then as they go on, they don't have those boundaries. They have no sense that the gift of their sexuality is sacred, that's private, that it's a gift, and because it's just been used. So they engage in patterns of being used, and we know that sexually abused children go on to be highly exploited in later life. They just don't have, they can be extremely naive and engage in what we call traumatic reenactments, which is repetition of the violation, repetition of putting themselves in dangerous situations, allowing people to have their way with them, and they don't seem to be able to fight back. And that's different than someone who's raped. A pervasive experience of abuse where you feel that that's your only value, is to be used by men, and that leads to pregnancies and many abortions. And there's many men who take young girls for the whole gamut, but even later in life, just that lack of boundaries. So the shame is experienced, the death of a part of yourself, because certainly our children are part of us. And so it's a way to ritualize the grieving and constantly be empty.
And Teresa, you write about how the procedure itself is a reenactment of that violation, right?
A stranger coming in and plunging instruments inside you and out, painful, and then leaving in secret where no one knows what happened to you, and you have to just carry on as if nothing happened. And when your trust is destroyed, it's replaced by the expectancy of an injury and exploitation and humiliation. That's part of the things that can be reenacted in later use and kind of become an identity. And it leaves you with few options when that's the pattern. Either you want to it's like sort of a illusion of that you have control over everything. I'm in charge now, so I can be a stripper, I can be a prostitute because I'm in charge and I feel safe, I feel empowered.
Oh boy, that's true. And you mentioned about repeat abortions, and I'd like to talk about that because a lot of people don't understand. Well, they self-talk. Well, why didn't I learn after the first one? I'm so that. Why did I do this? So if you could talk to the person that's had repeat abortions, I mean, it's not uncommon for women to have 4, 5, 10. I mean, even in some foreign countries, I've even heard of a woman that's had like 38 abortions. So can you talk briefly about that?
Yeah, briefly. It's a complex topic, but 50% of abortions in this country are repeat procedures. And everyone would say, oh, wouldn't you learn your lesson? Wouldn't you use birth control? But people actually open themselves up because there's a need to repeat until it's integrated, until you understand it. Repetition is one of the greatest indicators of trauma. And people don't intentionally repeat it. It's an unconscious thing that they want to complete what they started. Someone came on one of our retreats who had 10 abortions with the same guy, each time with the hope that he would take care of her this time, and each time he turned away. And it wasn't until after her retreat that she actually broke off that relationship, married somebody else, and all the girls from the retreat were her bridesmaids because she wanted to be a mother and have a child. But this is all part of the traumatic reenactment. It's very common. Another way to get yourself in the predicament again, and if you're not doing it with multiple abortions, people can do it with other behaviors that shame themselves, that make them feel powerless, that degrade their dignity in some way, and they force them to keep secrets. So it is complex.
And a lot of this is unconscious behavior. They don't realize it.
Well, that's the problem of not integrating the trauma, because we split off from the things that are unpleasant, there can be a lot of denial around it. But the body, I like to say that every symptom tells a story, and that the body will scream the story through the behaviors and sometimes through physical illnesses, because that's swimming around in there. And this is the brilliant thing about our minds, is that we seek to heal, we seek to find peace. But when trauma is prolonged, people become so used to that addictive cycle, and I'm going to call it addictive because the body releases all these stress chemicals that begin to feel normal, and so your whole entire nervous system gets deregulated, and they can have trouble. They might go into a pattern of being what I call a drama junkie, meaning you're addicted to the stress, and therefore you continue to create crisis after crisis, pregnancy after pregnancy crisis scares, and a lot of fantasy crisis as well. I'm hearing more and more, I have over the years, but that's something I'm hearing more and more of lately. Just trying to even have a fantasy where someone's going to be there for you. In a way, are disposable, but so are the relationships that create them.
Wow, that is incredible. Well, thank you for sharing. And Kevin, let's move on to you. And Dr. Burke, feel free to jump in as well, but you have a ministry and you have written a book, Tears of the Fisherman. And you have a ministry where you help men walk through their journey of healing. Would you like to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, my exposure to this issue and involvement in this issue as a professional and personally came about through my involvement with Teresa's retreats as they began to grow. Just so your listeners are aware, Rachel's Vineyard is open to men and women, to grandparents. Anyone who has been intimately connected with an abortion experience has been touched deeply by that. Sometimes they don't realize that until they're on there. So it's very important to understand the wider perspective on how people are impacted. So I was coming to learn about the retreat, to figure out what's Teresa up to here. And I quickly saw, I was very blessed and likely God's providence, that in the initial retreats where I came for myself and for those that I was helping, there were a number of men. And what struck me is something I was clueless about as a professional and personally. And that was that, wow, when men have an opportunity to kind of sit back, get away from their normal life and distractions, and talk about either their abortion or their abortion of their spouse or partner, because sometimes they're coming to support their spouse or partner, and they haven't maybe personally involved with the abortion. But in the case of these first few retreats, these were men, these were couples who had experienced abortion together. And the spiritual and emotional wounds, the shame and the guilt, and again, oftentimes they were not aware how deeply they were hurt by that. But then what's beautiful about this ministry, we're talking about a lot of dark stuff as we need to, but this also is a ministry very much of light and peace and healing and joy and restoration. As deep as these wounds are, and obviously we're talking about sexual abuse and abortion, we're talking about intimate experiences of darkness. And so there's lots of, there's a soil, there's an atmosphere that's created from those wounds that is both spiritually and psychologically very toxic. and forces can manipulate us, both the body, as Teresa talked about, the traumatic reactions of the body, but also spiritual darkness can also exploit those areas of vulnerability. In the same way, when Teresa developed this safe process for emotional spiritual healing, people can unpack these wounds. They can enter into that trauma safely on a psychological level, but they're also opened up to the Word of God, the sacraments of the Church and the Catholic model, the power of the Holy Spirit, the love and compassion of the body of Christ gathered to minister to those who are wounded. And you see miraculous things. It's as if you're back in the early church and Jesus is present in a very powerful way. So that's an important part of this ministry. I wanted to make sure to get that in.
Thank you. And, when we talk about the conscience, the conscience is not only the woman's conscience, it's also the man's conscience. And, he has to deal with maybe coercing the woman, not fighting for or even just the opposite, where they were powerless because they couldn't do anything. So it's a very complex issue with men as well as families, and how abortion can destroy the family relationship and the family bonds.
Yeah, that's a very important issue. And it's what my book here, if I get up on the Tears of the Fisherman, I go into great depth on men and abortion loss. And I call it Tears of the Fisherman because I look at the experience of Peter and his denial of Christ. Because the more I learned from men about their experience of abortion loss, I saw that it parallels in many ways Jesus and his experience, the experience of Peter, in those final days before the death of Jesus, where he pledged his life to protect Jesus. He was very strong in standing up before the other apostles and saying, I'm going to go to jail and death for you. And of course, we know what happened is he had to face his weakness and his pride and realize that he was scared. He didn't want to face the torture and death that Jesus suffered. A lot of men don't go into an unplanned pregnancy being bad people. They succumb to fear at that moment. And then they get into this role then of coercing the abortion or rationalizing or pushing or being even violent in other ways, coercing the abortion. And that, of course, as men, we're wired by the Lord to protect those that are entrusted to us. Now, that doesn't always happen, particularly if we have previous trauma ourselves. But, we're wired by the Lord to protect women and men that are entrusted to our care. And so when that pregnancy develops and we react in this way, we violate something very deep within us as men. And like Peter, we need to find a way to safely be able to share those very painful feelings, that shame and that guilt, and have a spiritual and an emotional way to walk through that pain and realize that vulnerability we experience at that time, and this is hard for men, but that vulnerability is essential to healing. And it doesn't feel that way because it feels like if I open up this part of my life, that's going to make me weaker as a man. What we find that men who go through this process of healing, whatever their involvement in the abortion, they come out and are blessed and strengthened as men, as fathers, as husbands, and particularly those with previous trauma in their history. Guys who have had injuries with their fathers, abusive, absent fathers, been through divorce in their families. When they are involved then later in their life in an abortion, it's very complex wound because they experience being abandoned and rejected as a child, and then they experience, in a sense, having experienced abuse. And then they go on to become a perpetrator where they participate in the death of an innocent child. So it's a very complicated wound, and so their symptoms are very intense. But the good news is when they go through the healing process and they have to memorialize that child and do public, very really effective rituals and exercises, and the Lord is very powerfully present, they can then bring their childhood losses as well as that abortion loss, and it's healing them on a number of different levels. And while they'll need to go through additional healing very likely in their lives, there's a fundamental shift that occurs very deep within the person. And then you can build on that in subsequent counseling and recovery work and spiritual direction, etc.
Thank you. And, I never gave my boyfriend the opportunity. And he had said that he would marry me, but, one thing you did say was so many times, and we talk about this quite often, that abortion is fear-based. And we get our abortions, or we feel like that's our option based on fears. And another thing is what you both have said is that women and men feel isolated. They share that secret, that soul wound, and because they don't know where to share and they don't trust, and it's not such a safe place. But what a relief it is when, like your ministries, you can say, I hear you, I understand, help me to understand further. And just having someone to say, I hear you, and to lead them through some steps in healing can be so transformative. And recovery is possible. Even though we might not think recovery is possible, it is very, very possible. One thing you said, Dr. Burke, is when you started in this journey, and Kevin, you're doing the same thing, you had said, I honored their need to grieve and understand what they experienced. I honored their need to grieve and to understand what they experienced. And we all need that. We all need to grieve. You know, you have programs for grandparents and even siblings. Abortion is a collective moral injury, that it just not only injures the people that are just very close to it, but it also injures us as a society, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's similar because once it's considered healthcare, and it's so prevalent and ready, there's a lot of people who to war. You know, the governments that send us to war, when you say that this is what everyone has to do to keep the peace. And I think that there's a similar idea that this is how I'm going to get my peace back. I'm going to have an abortion. And there's deep betrayal by whatever, you know, the whole collective endorsement of this, and the doctors. And, you know, they're all people that need to be dealt with, because you can have a lot of injury